Shah Rukh Khan gets put into 221G every time he renews his US visa. Every single time.
So Shah Rukh Khan gets a 221G every time
Moments where I've had to step away from the visa window because I'm getting so angry and frustrated with an applicant. Because the thing is, I can't refuse you, really. I can't be like, I'm invalidating this petition from Google because you are not telling me what I need to know. There's something going on that's worth a little bit more of my time. You walk in and you're like, well, this company says it has 20 employees, but they've only got 6 desks. What's going on here? The company never takes any action and can't take any action to protect the employee. The worst possible thing that you can do in a situation is not explain why you're doing something because you think the reason will get you in trouble, because what you're imagining is always so much worse. 221G can mean anything, because what 221G is a legal pause button. But when H1B applicants get in trouble, long-term trouble for them, it's when they start extending themselves to cover for the company.
Hi everyone, I am Priya from It's OKR and welcome back to our channel. And if you're new today, It's OKR is the content platform for South Asian immigrants, and we aim to educate, entertain and empower them. The topic for today is how to answer your questions when you're going for your H1B interview, or in short, like how to be best prepared for your H1B interview. And to help us with that conversation, we have no other than Joseph, who's an ex-visa officer who's taken a lot of these interviews. So today we will spend time talking to him, understanding how you should show up, how you should answer, things that you should keep in mind so that you feel absolutely prepared and confident for your visa interview. Hi, Joseph. Very nice to meet you, and thank you for taking the time to do this video.
Yeah, Priya, thanks so much. I love explaining this because, the H1B process is something that some of the biggest problems for applicants come out of spaces of miscommunication and misunderstanding. So I have a lot of experience with H1Bs, and actually H1Bs for a South Asian context, right? Because I was a visa officer for 7.5 years. I served 3 overseas assignments, and 2 of those 3 assignments were in India. So I was a first tour visa officer at the visa window, interviewing people at the US consulate in Kolkata for about 2.5 years. Okay. And then I was a visa officer and supervisor at the US consulate in Mumbai. I was lucky to live in 2 really wonderful cities. Even more likely to have actually met my, then girlfriend, now wife, when I was serving in Kolkata. And I myself am an immigrant. So I don't normally live in the United States. I live in Turkey most of the time. I'm also an OCI holder. So I have gone through the Indian immigration system and gone in for my interview and been nervous and not known what's going on and eventually gotten my card. So I understand kind of both sides of this process. And I understand that every system has its own way of doing things and a way that you can interact with it. And I just like to share some of those things about the H1B process, because it's something where the questions become very mechanical, sometimes even minimal, but the process is very different from what most people think of in an average American student visa, right? Or an average American tourist visa.
So thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your story. I would like to share that I'm actually from Calcutta or the Durgapur area, and my husband is from Mumbai. So I feel like there are some parallels, and it's wonderful that you're an immigrant and you've had the journey. So since you've lived it, it's just such a great way to have this conversation. So first question, of course, is going to be, what are the visa officers looking for?
Yeah, the visa officers are looking for a completed interview. So when you are a visa officer, right? So I was a visa specialist. I was a consular coned officer, right? But, the way the U.S. consulates and embassies work is when you're an American diplomat, you join in one of several career channels, right? No matter what channel you're in, you are going to spend your first 1 or 2 assignments doing visa work. So what the visa officer is really looking for in the situation, if you're going to put yourself in their shoes, is they're a first tour officer. If they're in a place like Mumbai, there's a lot of them. It's hard to stand out, right? It's hard to make a name for yourself. And what you're judged on is how many visas can you get done in a day? And so the pressure on them is like issue or keep moving, right? And that creates a lot of the frustration, and I think the kind of emotional nature, the anger, or the kind of stuff that gets taken out on the applicant when the officer is like, I see that window 32, window 31, window 29 through 27, they're all hitting 60. It's 11 o'clock. I'm still at 50 or 45. and this is not looking good for me. So what they're looking for in an H1B is, are you going to be simple for me, or are you going to be a problem? Right? Because the thing about H1Bs is when they're simple, they're so simple. When they are a problem, they are a big problem. Right? So H1Bs from an officer's perspective are the easiest interviews you ever do or the hardest ones. And that really depends a lot on the circumstances of the applicant and crucially the circumstances of the petition and the petitioner.
When you say something is easy and something is difficult, help me break that down a little bit more on what to a visa officer is an easy applicant and what to a visa officer is a more difficult applicant.
So if you think about it, you're making a decision and you're making a rapid decision and you want to be able to make it consistently and in accordance with the law. And then you want to hit the things that you legally have to do. So all you legally really need to do in an H1B visa interview is make sure the person has a university education or equivalent. I don't think ever, and I've probably done I did like 60,000 visas in Calcutta, maybe a slightly smaller number. So in India, I've probably done 70, 80,000 visas total. Wow. Maybe 20% of those, maybe sometimes up to a quarter were H1Bs. I don't think I ever saw someone being like, I have a skill equivalent to university education. It was usually people at a BTech, BCom, something like that. But it doesn't really matter the subject. You just need to have a university degree. Right? That's a legal requirement. And then the other thing is I've got to give you the William Wilberforce pamphlet on labor exploitation, which is about your rights as a worker in the United States. Past that, what I'm really about is not so much, am I going to give you the visa or not? But is this a case where I can say, okay, you're good? Or am I going to flag you for a couple more questions because there's a bigger issue going on? As a visa officer, I really can't deny an H1B right there at the window. I can't just come in and say, nope, not you, not today, get out of here. That's not within my power because it's a petition-based visa, right? Where a petitioner, they've won the lottery, they've said it, they've convinced U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, we need this foreign employee, that we cannot find an American to do this job. And this is our petition to bring them as a worker. So I'm not in a situation where I'm like, get out of here, 214B. I don't believe you. But I am in a situation where other concerns are at play. So what I'm looking for is clarity of answers, honestly, sticking with the certain profile that's consistent, right? When you have the H1B sector, there's big movers in that space. Cognizant, Tata Consultancy Services, Amazon. You know, if they're known, if I'm like, this is a consistent company that we understand what they're doing, if you've got a BTech, if you've got a valid petition, if you're not popping up when your fingerprints get scanned in as an internationally wanted terrorist and you're able to answer some basic questions, I'd feel comfortable finishing that interview in 2-3 questions, maybe trying to get it down to 15 or 20 seconds and getting you out of there. So one more number goes up on my 11C report and my boss is happy with me. A lot of questions that H1B interviewees get asked are questions to move the process along. Right. So it's things like, are you married? And it's like, okay, can I prove I'm married? What I'm asking for is one more person coming on this petition because the systems are not perfect. Sometimes the petition is approved, but it's approved for one person. You've just gotten married. That's fine. But it says beep, number of petitioners exceeded. And usually if I'm just like, oh, you're married, you have kids, that's fine. Do you have kids? Oh, yeah, they're U.S. citizens. They're born in the U.S. Okay, fantastic. Then I don't need to worry about the number of people on the petition. There are the areas where it really matters is talking about your work relationship, your client relationship, your end client relationship, and your company. That's not a situation where, absent a couple extreme cases, many people wind up refused, and you wouldn't be refused at the window. But it's, are you going into administrative processing or not? Am I pulling you in for additional interviews? Do I have substantive concerns about the legality of what you're doing? So we like the big companies, not because they're necessarily big, not because there's a ranking of these companies are good. Plenty of small companies have fine reputations, but it's because they are spoken for, they are known, and they are understood. I also think the type of work someone does in the United States on an H-1B has a significant bearing on the level of concern and attention that the officer will give them. And I have We can
Got
get
it.
into that later. Yeah.
Yes, no, that's super helpful. And I want to talk about that. But I think the number one thing that I think for anyone who's listening would be super interesting to hear is the visa officer is not there to deny the visa. So they should feel confident being that as long as they are in a big company, they know what they're talking about. They have their applications in order. And then we're going to continue to talk about like what kind of work they're doing, different kind of tips, red flags, so that they can feel comfortable.
Yeah.
But that's brilliant. The one thing that would be super helpful is I know you spoke about a ton of things that the visa officer is actually looking for, but it would be helpful if you can give us like a little bit of a checklist or a summary of the most important parameters or factors that you are testing someone on an H1B visa interview.
Yeah. So the number one thing, and this is the source of my biggest frustration with H1B workers, and we can talk about this in terms of like techies, right? Oh, what's the hardest thing in the world for a techie to do? It's to tell a non-techie person what their job is. That question is maybe the most crucial question for a visa officer in India looking at an H1B. Like, what is your job? What do you do? And there is a lot of stress, fear, miscommunication about this question where I've had like the moments where I've had to step away from the visa window because I'm getting so angry and frustrated with an applicant. Because the thing is, I can't refuse you, really. I can't be like, I'm invalidating this petition from Google because you are not telling me what I need to know. In fact, I'm stuck there with you until I determine these things. And so when someone can't explain their job or their duties or is recalcitrant or being kind of obtuse or overly technical, like, you know, it's like that play, No Exit, where the people realize slowly that they're dead and they're in hell because they're in a room that they can never leave. Yeah. That can be a bad H1B visa interview because it's like, I can't tell you I can't call security and just kick you out of the building. I've got to stay here and then figure out my questions. And my questions are pretty serious. I am basically asking, like, when you come in for an H1B, it's like, are you the person on the petition? Like at a very basic level, do you match the identity of the person, right? At a basic level, like you're coming into the consulate so you can get your face, get your fingerprints, get your passport. So like, let's just make sure that this is the person. And then, are you doing what you say you're going to do in the petition is the other big question, right? And then based off of that, do I have other concerns about your duties in the United States? Not from a perspective of like normal visa issuance, like, are you going to stay illegally? Are you going to work? Those are the two big concerns. And you know what? You can have immigrant intent on an H1B. You obviously can go and work and earn money on an H1B. So that's not the problem. But what I'm thinking about is in the position of, is U.S. labor law being upheld? And is more so the company rather than the person trying to subvert the rules of the game, basically. Because an H1B is a petition for an alien worker to go and do a specific thing for a specific client. It's not open work permission.
Correct.
Right?
Got it.
And the big concerns are basically around areas of what's called loss of administrative control.
So one second before we go into the red flags or the areas of concern, the most important parameters that you're testing someone on are usually what is their occupation exactly, what company they're working for, what client, what exactly they're going to do, and their identity, whether it's matching the same person who's on the application.
Exactly. And most of the substantive questions you will get as a visa officer about the H-1B application itself will be about your role and duty in the company. So when someone comes up and they say, hey, my petitioner is General Motors. I'm a mechanical engineer. I designed the brakes for commercial cargo trucks. And I work in a factory. Like you work in a physical factory building an object. I work for Boeing. I work for Intel, right? That instantly I breathe a sigh of relief because I don't have to figure out a business relationship, right? Yep. American immigration law was really last majorly touched or reformed, these parts of it, in like the 60s or 70s, maybe. So there's not a lot of appreciation for a digital economy or what that means. So if you have a physical job, right, in a place making a tangible product, that becomes very easy for the visa.
That becomes very easy. But if you are a techie, going back to your point, being able to tell your story in a way that this is exactly what I will be doing is really important. What would you say is a good answer for a techie?
Well, what would make a visa officer relaxed is to always start with the final application of what you do in the real world. If someone in the same situation comes up and says like, hey, yeah, no, I work for Cognizant. There's a mid-vendor, but we make the software that banks use to manage personal checking accounts. And I'm like, oh, okay, you've given me an example where I can place what this work is. I provide IT services to municipal governments for the wastewater management computer solution. These are all examples of things people have actually told me. I'm like, oh, okay, so that's what you do. You work for this company and your services are contracted through them. We deal with back of house enterprise software for a mid-sized grocery store chain in the Midwest of the United States.
Yeah. So more clear, more articulate, no guessing.
You don't even have to be articulate or clear, but you have to be, first of all, start with the tangible world and then move backwards for your role in it, right? Avoid jargon. Absolutely do not use acronyms. So it's like, I'm a SQL dev ops. And I'm like, what? It's like, it's agile DevOps. I'm like, that does not help me. I don't work in your industry. I don't understand these terms. That's really the key skill, is be able to practice this on your uncles and aunties, practice this on a 12-year-old you meet at a wedding, right? Just talk to someone with absolutely no knowledge of your profession, your industry, what you do, and describe in plain English, maximum 2 or 3 sentences, what the application of your work is, right? And it's like, okay, so I understand what it is you do. And now I'm just checking for a couple things in the company, right?
Got it.
Are there red flags in the company? Are there red flags about the individual? So, when I said I can't refuse your visa at the window, and that's true in the sense of I can't say, no, I don't think you should have this job because the company's gone through the process. But if you think about it in the US system, there's the petition and then there's the applicant, right? Mm-hmm. The applicant can be perhaps qualified for the petition, but not eligible for entry to the United States because of something else that's happened. You previously committed fraud while in the United States. You stayed illegally in the United States. You have a criminal record that issue needs to be examined and resolved. I mean, these are all things that I've encountered. So there's the petition, there's the person, and sometimes there's, kind of interplay between that. I think we should probably cover, though, the red flags in terms of companies and the red flags in terms of frequent patterns of like techie H1B misuse, which are really the thing at play when visa officers are asking questions.
Yes, and I think that was definitely going to be my next question. Like, when I understand when a candidate is unable to explain what they do. So let's talk about it from an applicant perspective, and then we can move to the different perspective as well. So from an applicant perspective, what are some of the other mistakes made by a candidate that will actually lead to a rejection?
Some of them, the biggest mistake you can make as a candidate that would lead to rejection is signing on with a disreputable company. Right. I mean, the biggest mistake that I see applicants make are when, and this has been very unfortunate when I've seen people who've had pretty long-term, potential immigration effects for like green card or, permanent residency in the US come from signing on with a company that was not 100% above board. Because although the company faces consequences, the company gets dissolved or is shut down or whatever, the ineligibility is if you're like, hey, this company, committed fraud and you're the beneficiary of it, that ineligibility sticks to you years after potentially the company folds. So, choose your employer very carefully. Make sure they're above board, make sure they're reputable, make sure that they have, so that the two areas that they're really concerned about in terms of red flags that applicants can get involved with are what's called loss of administrative control and benching. Right. And loss of administrative control means basically, do you work for who you work for? Right. Because, you can do consultancy work. You can do BPO work. You can have mid vendors, or you can be, a company's tech guy brought out as an outside contractor on an H1B. That's fine. But at a basic level, you're going to need to be able to articulate, like, who do you report to on a daily basis? Who's your boss? Who's your subordinate? What's your relationship? Because if it's a situation where this company has an H1B for you and we find you a mid vendor and they find another vendor and then that second vendor places you with the third company, and maybe the final company is a reputable one, there's a question of like, well, are you working for the person that says you're working for on your petition? Or are you working at this other company through a number of agencies, right? H-1Bs are not open work permission. And so that's the big red flag. Mid-vendors were always a red flag. Physical work location, it's changing a bit post-COVID, but there's still going to be a question of basically, if you are not at the work location of your petitioner, what's your relationship to your petitioner? Are you actually working for them? How much time with the clients, how much time versus that? If red flags come up, it's not a situation where, oh, you work offsite. Oh, you work client side. Oh, you have a mid-vendor. You're refused. No, what it means is now I'm looking into this. Now we're in a position of actually justifying this. So the thing about the H-1B interviews, remember what I said, they're the easiest until they're the hardest. It's either, well, this is in order. The petition looks good. You've got the educational requirements. Have a nice time in America. Here's your Wilberforce pamphlet. Or we're now at a potentially 2 or 3 stage investigative process. H-1Bs are some of the only non-immigrant visas where I've actually gone through people's pay stubs. I've actually gone through people's tax records. I want to see people's electrical bills.
So at what point are you going to do that? Is it mainly for cases where someone is working as a consultant and they will be client side? Talk to me a little bit more about the pay, salary or pay slip, how big of a role it plays.
Like if someone has, for example, a conspicuously low salary for their profession, if they're like, I'm a systems administrator, I'm making $38,000 a year. Even if you're in a low cost of living area, I would Google what's the Department of Labor prevailing wage for that position. Is it out of step? Does it look like you're being taken advantage of? Obviously, there's no such thing as a suspiciously high salary. Yeah. No one's ever going to say.
What would you say is a baseline from a salary standpoint? Below, is that something that you can share?
Generally, it's all rule of thumb and it's all on norms. If someone's above 6 figures US dollars, I'm not asking any questions, and that's probably also indicative to me that the company's not playing games or trying to squeeze them for some sort of exploitative labor relationship or mid-vendor stuff.
When you say 6 figures, are you talking about base or the overall package?
Oh, every conversation is overall package. And you need to make every conversation with the visa officer overall package. This is one of the biggest disconnects that I found working in India with Indian applicants is people are they give very specific answers about their profession, their work, and money in general, where it'll be like, what's your income? Well, my salary is 4 lakh per annum. Oh, well, I also get bonuses. That's actually 12 lakh per annum. And I'm like, well, why didn't you mention that? Well, you didn't ask, officer, sir. Anytime you talk with an American visa officer and you are talking about money, you want to give them the big overall situation, right? Where, if there's a situation where your company supplies housing for you, that doesn't really happen with the US, but for like people who work, for example, in Dubai, it happens quite commonly. They're like, well, I'm making this many, dinars per month, but I also have housing taken care of. I'm like, okay, well, you want to give me the whole package, right? Because what I'm looking at is it's not like there's a magic number upon which you get a visa, but there's a level of compensation where I don't believe that the company is trying to
take advantage of you
or skirt the regulations, right? So anything suspiciously low for your area, like generally, if you are south of 70,000 US dollars a year, I'm going to ask a couple more questions. And you're like, well, I'm living in a small town. It's the middle of Nebraska. I'm a junior employee. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess this is still a good job. That's not in there. That's not like the law, but I'm going to be looking a little more closely to that. If it's a situation where it's a very complicated working relationship, and I mean complicated, not in terms of what you are doing or like, oh, the bosses change all the time, but like, this company owns that company and is acquired by that company. Even that's fine because, sometimes you will get, USCIS is not fast. You will get a petition back that has the name of a company that doesn't exist. I'm like, what's going on? And it can all be resolved by you saying the company got bought and the name changed. That's it. It's the same company, right? That level of clarification can help. Red flags are like, this is a mid-vendor. I'm working in like a different city or state than the actual location of my company. If it's a situation where, there's like, it sounds like you don't have a lot of work to do with the actual company who put you there. Multiple mid-vendors is always a red flag. it used to be kind of an attitude that internal projects were a red flag. Oh, I'm working on an internal project because that was felt to be code for benching.
Yep.
There has been a marked move away from that. I have to say, in my time as a visa officer, especially that snapshot of like what it was like to work in India in 2016 versus what it was like to work in India in 2022. There was definitely a move away from concerning ourselves with internal projects. I think that was also because that's a DHS problem, not a State Department or an embassy problem, right? Homeland Security, the HSI or Homeland Security investigations are, in terms of H1Bs, it's one of the only times you would talk to law enforcement in the United States as a visa officer.
Got it.
Right. So if I think that there's something weird, or like it's a company I've never heard of before, or like on the petition, you go into the petition, it's like date founded, number of employees, right? There's just areas where more questions get asked. Right. Yeah. And so if I'm looking and you're like, you are you have a boring story. I went on an F1. I did my bachelor's. I went on and did my master's in the United States. I went on CPT, OPT, and now I'm getting hired on an H1B. That's the same company that I did CPT, OPT on. By the way, that company is, Salesforce. Well, there's not much to ask questions about. That's all laid out right there. I might ask some things about your CPT, OPT, especially if you didn't go and get visa stamping.
Yeah, I want to pause for a second before we go into the CPT, OPT and keep talking about the rejection or red flags aspect. I think the one thing that we do want to cover about that is the administrative processing or 221G. So what are some of the reasons behind getting an admin processing or a 221G, and how can a candidate ensure that they don't get a 221G, or alternatively, how do we respond to it?
221G can mean anything. Because what 221G is a legal pause button. The only thing the State Department is obligated to do to tell you about what's going on with your visa is to tell you if you're refused or not. 221G is a technical type of refusal that's really a pause button. Does that make sense? Like, there can be good 221Gs. The 221G can be anything from, hey, the computer's broken and your fingerprint clearance is back from DC. 221G is everything from that to, I am putting you under criminal investigation. You're on 221G. There's parts of 221G, things covered under 221G that I'm not free and able to talk about because there are certain security procedures and things like that. That was something I encountered more when I was working in the Middle East region, right?
Got it.
So it can be any number of things. Sometimes you've just been randomly selected. You're just lucky. Sometimes you have a common name, right? One of my favorite stories is not favorite. It's actually stupid. But, Shah Rukh Khan gets put into 221G every time he renews his U.S. visa. Every single time. And there's a name match. We know why it's happening. And he kind of posed this question once in an interview. He's like, I don't mind, but why does it happen every time? Like, you must have it figured out that I'm not a problem at this point, but it keeps happening. And that's because of a systems trigger, right? And even we can't delete it. And it's extremely embarrassing. And like the ambassador gets called about it. It's like Shah Rukh Khan is in the newspaper and he's saying we were making him wait for his visa again. And this is not good. That is something that's going to be covered by.
So Shah Rukh Khan gets a 221G every time.
He gets a 221G every single time. Yeah. And we don't know how to stop it, even though we're like, no, we have his fingerprints. It's him. But 221G for an H1B, if I'm making the decision to put someone into 221G as a visa officer, I've decided that in this interaction that I'm trying to get done as fast as possible, there's something going on that's worth a little bit more of my time. Red flags for companies: if it's new, if it's small, if it has a abnormal space, like physically, if it's a situation where, like, there have been situations where we've recommended investigations to Homeland Security to go and do what's called a site visit, which isn't a formal investigation. It's literally just poking in. And you walk in and you're like, well, this company says it has 20 employees, but they've only got 6 desks. What's going on here? Right. That's something that can be revealed in 221G. It could be anything as like your petition's missing or I want to review it. What you're going to ask for and what you're going to look at is really going to be dependent on what the red flag is. So if I'm like, I don't know, is this guy getting benched? If I'm thinking, is this lady working through too many mid vendors? Do I have loss of administrative control concerns? Right. I'm going to ask for different things. And then there's also a higher level of chance with H-1Bs of escalation to what's called the fraud prevention unit, right? Where basically if you are a visa officer and you're like, hey, there's a red flag, or another much more common thing is that there's a tip off from domestically from the United States where it'll be in the computer associated with the petition, not the person. Hey, this petition came back with derogatory information. It was approved, but the people had to look at the company and they were like, hey, you might want to look into this for whatever reason. Then the hapless employee who has no clue that their company is somehow a problem is being like, hey, what's your working address? This is really tough when the person's like never been to the US before. It's their first time and you're being asked about it. You're put into 221G. You can tell what happens in 221G. Sometimes you're just missing a form. Sometimes you just need to fix something in the computer. The officer usually tells you if that's the case.
So that was my next question. Like, are we able to get clarity on why we were issued a 221G and how does a candidate respond to it in case they get one?
You're not going to get clarity because it can mean so many things. The only, if they ask you for an additional form called a DS-5535, or if you're sent like, hey, fill this out and complete it, then it's like you've been randomly selected for security screening or something like that. If it is a situation where someone's like, hey, I took a vacation in Iran, and they're like, 221G, can you just fill out this additional form? I mean, that's gonna okay, well, it's a travel pattern that's resulted in security screening. That's really different if it's like, hey, 221G, come in for another interview, right? That's a very different situation. The other thing is, if it's 221G, why don't you wait a bit? We're going to have someone else talk to you. And you're pulled aside, and then like an Indian employee from the consulate comes out and starts talking to you. That's the fraud prevention unit, right? That's about a company. That's about an ongoing issue. There's two things that can be in these cases. It's one of those things where I have seen H1B visa applicants start getting overly worried about this. And then, how would I say this? Extending themselves to cover the company, right? Where there's like, hey, we need to talk with you. There's an investigator. There's like, someone from the diplomatic security or even the FBI there. There's some Indian guy. And our fraud prevention unit guys are usually former Indian police, right? And they're asking questions in kind of a way, where's this location? H1Bs have this issue, like, your usual kind of nice guy techie is like, oh no, I'm going to get in trouble. Like, I better answer this. These are questions about me. 80% of the time, maybe closer to 85% of the time, it's a question about the company, not about you. But when H1B applicants get in trouble, long-term trouble for them, it's when they start extending themselves to cover for the company. Does that make sense? Like, no, I got it. Or like, I shouldn't tell my company. I'll get in trouble. They won't like me. I'm a new employee. If I say I was 221G, they want this document, I'll produce it. I'm in 221G, but I'm not going to tell my boss why or what's going on. Because in the American system, there's, like I said, there's the petition and there's the applicant. If you knowingly provide misinformation to a visa officer and you lie and you're lying to a visa officer and then you get found out, that ineligibility sticks to you. If the petition gets revoked because you worked for a shady company and then you come back and you're working for a reputable company, that's no problem. I've issued plenty of those. Right?
Got it. Yeah, actually, that was going to be my next question as well. Like, what are the chances of getting an approval if their visa was rejected earlier in any category? So looks like if it was someone, not a reputed company, got rejected, got through a reputed company, and then you had all the answers, you're okay. But yes, talk to us about other
so
scenarios.
Previous refusals, right? So my advice, the difference is there's, when you refuse an H1B, you revoke the petition. Right? A petition revocation memo is sent to the United States for the petition to be revoked. It's not quite a refusal. And there would be some questions about that. But if you, for example, work for a small, strange company and your petition is revoked and you come back and you have a petition from a good company with no problems, not big, small, not well-known, just a company with no problems, we'll issue that. We'll probably ask you a couple more questions previously. Hey, how did you find this job? Where were you set up with it? Did a recruiter or vendor put you in touch with it? Some of those things can be red flags, right? Like, did you use a recruiting service? If you're like, hey, I found this on LinkedIn. I found this on this job site in India. I did this, but now everything's fine. Then everything's fine. refusals for other type of visas because of this petition system kind of don't matter. You could walk up and be like, yeah, I was refused a tourist visa 6 times. Right? You're like, hey, I kept trying to do my master's in the United States and I flubbed the interview and I was too nervous and they refused me. By the time the H1B rolls around, I can't refuse based off of that. I can't refuse based off of it is the petition or not. It's the employee relationship exists or not. So, if the person has been refused because of a reason that makes them ineligible, right? Like I have a serious criminal conviction in my home country. Or some other ineligibilities. I knowingly committed fraud in my previous visa interview. You could walk in and have been deported from Canada and I'm still going to give you an H1B as long as the paperwork is in order. Right.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense because my brother's B1, B2 was rejected and he got his H1B fine.
No problem.
We've done a whole video on that and about his experience as well. If anyone is interested, I'll link that in the description box. So no, that is super helpful. I have one question. As you were talking through this, it came to my mind. What if I'm working for a company that is fully remote and doesn't have an office? Is that going to be a red flag for a visa officer?
I don't know what the State Department thinks of those cases because the State Department doesn't know what they think of those cases. So I remember when we started opening in 2021, 2022, as vaccination started spreading around India. And it was like, okay, non-essential travel is open. We're bringing in H1B people. And I was like, one of my juniors was like, hey, what do we think about remote work? And I was like, we don't think about remote work. Just don't answer, don't ask, don't answer, because the policy hasn't kind of emerged. I have dealt with people consulting, my clients at Argo who are in remote relationships with their company. What's important is to address the workflow and the situation, right? And why you are remote. So in this case, the question is, why do you need an H1B for this? Just kind of a philosophical question. And they basically said, look, I live in New Jersey. My company's in Florida. It's my second job in the US. They want someone in the same time zone. This was not working, me being back in India. We have a stand-up check-in meeting every day. I have a meeting with my manager every week. I have a meeting with my 2 different subordinates on 2 different days of that week. I maintain an ongoing relationship of management and control with the client and with my company. Right. So if you are working remotely, my advice would be to clarify why you need to be in the United States. Like, why not just work remote from another place?
From India. Yeah.
And then, okay, you aren't physically there. How is that relationship of reporting? Basically, your chain of command becomes very important. Who you work for becomes very important. That's anything in an H1B relationship. But if these concerns come up, that's it. I haven't really mentioned much about the direct benching concerns because a lot of that has been stamped out and it's a little harder to catch. But that is a situation where, you need to be in a salary position and you need to be getting paid regularly on time. Right. And that the only, the situations in terms of benching concerns is when if there's a lot of fluctuations in your take home pay, like on a monthly or weekly basis, that's going to need to be explained, or that's a potential red flag. But yeah, in terms of remote work, it emphasize the relationship rather than where you are physically, right? Because remote work is perhaps a complicating disadvantage, but the fact that remote relationships involve, you could make an argument that actually I have much more managerial control, even though I work at an end client site or I work from my house because of remote work, right? I'm on Slack with my manager all the time. These are things that should be emphasized because it's not a quiz where you need to give a right answer to pass the exam. It really is a question answer where context can matter. If you provide the context, then I feel good. If you start acting like I need to hide something just because I think the answer will be bad, I guarantee you 90% of the time, the accurate situation is not nearly as bad as the act of hiding it, right?
Got it.
And that's kind of, the one last piece. If we're talking about red flags, if we're talking about being an H1B, I do want to come back and return to, if you're talking about someone who's on a longer immigrant journey and an employee relationship is part of that, just be aware that the company is the company and you are you, and never take any legal or immigration process risk upon yourself when it really belongs to the company. Right? Never assume that the petition and issues with the petition or petitioner are issues with you, and never extend yourself to cover it, because believe it, I've seen it so many times. The company never takes any action and can't take any action to protect the employee. Right. And, the other thing is, if it's a situation where there's like multiple investigations, where you think that law enforcement might be involved, when it's, if you're in immigration status and you're like, the Homeland Security is coming and visiting your office and being like, hey, how many people work here? I mean, that's not a red flag on its own. A lot of people get investigated and it's fine. But so many times with Argo, people come to me in bad situations with refusals, with ineligibilities. And I'm like, hey, do you have, you're in the United States right now. Do you have a lawyer? And they're like, well, the company's giving me a lawyer. The company's lawyer protects the company, right? And if you're in a situation where you're in 221G, where they're asking a lot of questions, where there's follow-up interviews, like, think about yourself as a person before you think about the employer, which is being investigated, and they're not exactly the same thing, No,
appreciate that. And for anyone who's listening, if you're more interested in learning about Argo, I will leave that in the description box as well. If you are facing rejections and looking to prepare for interviews, they offer the services with visa officers, so probably something to check out. Last couple of questions, Joseph. We appreciate you being so detailed and helping tell the stories in a way that seem very, very relatable. The one piece of question that we get all the time is, how do you view day one CPT? Is that a red flag for visa officers?
So we would call something hold your nose and issue, right? Where there's basically like, it stinks, you're holding your nose, but you can't really have a basis to refuse someone off of this, right? So once you've entered H1B territory, you've kind of ascended. It almost works as a pseudo immigrant visa, right? The only thing that they can do to refuse it is to like substantively find a problem with the petition. Anything you do, as long as it's not an ineligibility before that, is not a red flag for an H1B. Now, if I see that you went to the United States on an F1, you did same day CPT at a school, then you did a master's degree for a day one CPT school, and then you did a second master's degree for another day one CPT school. If you walk up to me and say, I'd like a business visa, if you walk up to me and say, hey, I'd like to do a third master's, I will 214B you so fast your head would spin, because it shows an intent that's not really primarily education. I see you, I see that. I'm like, oh, okay, that's what you're doing, huh? I see. You get in, you got an I-20 for a good school, immediately switch to a cheaper school with day one CPT. You're doing this, you're doing that. And now you just so happen to find this job with a company that was incorporated 2 months ago. And it turns out that the founders and everyone who works there is also from India, from the same state as you, and you're working at a place that's not, if you're that kind of person, after a while, you develop a bit of a sixth sense. You can kind of smell it, right? Like, ooh, you're being cute. But if the petition's valid, if everything's fine, I'm like, I might not like this, but I'm going to issue it because I don't really have an option to refuse at my own largesse, right?
Oh, got it. Super helpful. I think that's also very interesting to learn about day one CPT, because there is so much misinformation around what will happen and nervousness around if I was on day one CPT. So appreciate you clarifying that. My next one is
it's legal, right?
It's legal.
Like, yeah.
Yes. If someone is applying for a change of status, say H4 to H1B, are there any chances of rejection?
That's a question for USCIS if you are changing status in the United States. I would have to say that the thing you have to remember, if you have changed status domestically in America, if you have, even if you entered on an F1 and it's been more than 5 years, if you were on an H4 and then you were on an H1B and now you're just going for the sticker, but you've actually been at the company for a while, the thing to remember, please have pity on the dear visa officers. Their systems do not sync up perfectly with the USCIS system. So especially if a visa officer is new to H1Bs, if they're even new to student visas, there have been situations where freshly trained officers coming out of the pandemic, where they didn't have a lot of experience, have gone to people and be like, you overstayed your visa because this expired. this expired 2 years ago, this F1, and you're already in there. You've been there illegally. And this officer literally didn't know that you can change status domestically in the United States. No one had ever told them. They weren't a consular professional, right? You were never trained on how the domestic side of the immigration system.
So how does one handle that? How does one handle that?
You handle that by being able to kind of walk the officer through what happened. Don't give a lot of dates and don't give excess information. The visa officer, remember, is on the edge of sensory overload at all times. So then on March 22nd, 2018, I did that. And then on April 25th, 2019, I changed to this one. And then on that one, like these are all these little details. You want to establish the order of events first. Chronological order is important, especially as it becomes more complicated. If you get into a space of counting exact days, be ready for that, but always give total numbers of days, not dates. Never put a visa officer in a situation where they have to do math in their heads, right? Because your interview 110 of the day, your interview 70 of the day, and you're saying, well, from this date to this date, it's like, was that a leap year? I don't know. For 8 months, I was on CPT OPT. Then I switched to H4 after I got married. Then after 2 years, I switched to H1B, but I was working on change of status for 6 months. And now I'm in India for my visa stamping.
Got it.
That's the register that you would want to.
Chronology is important. Super helpful. I think the only piece of question that I have there is, for example, if I was on H4 visa and this year my H1B got picked, I found an employer, and now I am going to India to get it activated, so is that a similar process? Like you will be just like another H1B candidate and make sure.
And it happens a lot. You're just like another H1B. And like, honestly, a lot of these things, if it's not clear from a systems issue, you just be like, no, I was on H4 before. And it's like, okay, great. There, it's done. Most H1B interviews go very, very smoothly. When they get complicated, there's a chance that they can get very complicated. And that's where services like Argo come in and what I do can come in, because there's no such thing. Once you get to the point where the fraud prevention unit is there, once you get to the point where I'm asking for your tax returns, there's no such thing as a common reason or a general reason that is happening, right? And there are some times where it's just a little paperwork issue that needs to be cleared up. And there are some times where I would tell someone like, hey, you should leave this company before things get bad, right? That's all person to person. And that gets very case by case.
So as long as you are working for a big company, you're able to explain what you do, you are the same person.
And the relationship and stuff like that, it's fine. I think that H1Bs oftentimes are stunned by how quickly their cases are resolved. A lot of people are like, when does the interview happen? I'm like, it just happened. You're approved. Goodbye. It'll come in the mail, right? If it is a situation where you are in a complicated situation, that's where Argo exists, especially because a lot of the things that an immigration attorney is who you want to talk to domestically for an RFE, for anything involving USCIS. What happens at the consulates is a bit more of a black box and can be very unique from the perspective of the applicant, but also from the perspective of the officer, right? H1B, advanced H1B work, the investigations, looking into it, is kind of a specialized role, right? That you get handed of like, hey, here's, we were working on this case. It could take potentially weeks sometimes.
So for Argo, you would recommend if someone is gone for an interview and is stuck there or for any reason.
If they're in 221G, if really the interview departs significantly, if the interview departs significantly from the usual, where'd you go to college? What's your highest level of education? Who's your end client? What do you do? How much do you earn in a year? Are you married? Where did you do OPT? If it departs from that general kind of basket or of 3 to 5 questions,
then they should come back and look at Argo and probably try to get some
Argo before you make any drastic moves, or you're like, well, I just gave all my documents to them, but I'm not telling my parent company about it. You save that for when you get a green card. So an H1B is for finding an employer, sticking with them in a role, and staying within what you're allowed to do on the petition.
Got it. Thank you. I have one question around, are there any tips for people if they are going with their spouse and kids for an H1B interview?
I mean, bring picture books for the kids because you're going to wait and they're going to go kind of crazy without smartphones. You're not allowed to carry that into the embassy. The spouse and kids being there, that's fine. It's usually just going to be hey, how long have you been married? If you've got the kids together, no one's really going to be asking a lot of questions. And it's not really a situation for like an H4. Like, as long as, how do I say this? If you're married, you're married. Like, we're not really digging into, is this a legitimate relationship? Is this real? Show us wedding photos. I mean, that's quite nice to look at because sometimes they're lovely photos and everyone's very happy and you're very bored in your H1B adjudicator job. But there's not really anything super special about that other than I believe they're moving more towards interview waiver for H4 dependents. And so the number of situations where you need to bring children or a spouse to an interview are declining sharply.
Got it. Super helpful. And I know the consulate bit came up a bit in the beginning. So I wanted to ask, does the consulate where I'm getting my H1B stamped matter, whether it's Calcutta, Delhi, Chennai, Mumbai, etc.? Do you have a recommendation or tip?
I will say that there's all of India is what they call a visa mill. It's big, it's moving fast. There are certain different kind of markets in each area that get different types of attention. So in Mumbai, it was a bit normal for people to have more international business or finance focused stuff. Vice Hyderabad, where it's all BPO, all consultancy, all the time. Right. And they have their own very refined sets of procedures for dealing with H1Bs in Hyderabad and Chennai, right, where there's the big tech work. And it's if you're from one of the big companies, go down there because they're just good, TCS, approved. Someone at HSBC or Barclays coming through Bombay makes a lot of sense. But that being said, this isn't like tourist visas or student visas. It's one of the most consistent visa types because as far as the office is concerned, you're only really looking at a couple of things.
Yeah. While we are at it, for the tourist visa or a student visa, would you recommend a particular consulate?
No, because they are all very responsive to situations in their certain consulate, right? So one of the things when we were in Calcutta is they were Calcutta is easy for students. And we were well, Calcutta has so many universities in it that the students are all of very high quality. So we approve more of them, right? And that was why. If someone came from outside the consular district thinking we were about to go easy on them, it's certain areas of the country are a little stricter, right? Where if you're in a part of the country that has high rates of illegal outmigration to the United States, if you're bluntly looking at Gujarat or Punjab and someone comes in for an H1B, for a B1, B2, and they're from there, well, 22-year-old Punjabi guy going to a cousin's wedding, never traveled before internationally, that's going to be a hard profile to break out of simply because that's a pattern that's been verified by data. There are certain situations where for an H1B applicant or a B1, B2 applicant, being part of the assembly line can be advantageous. So if you work for a big company, if you work for Cognizant or TCS, and you're just let me just get my appointment in Hyderabad. I'm not from there, but you're just in the row with everyone else. And you're getting approved with everyone else.
Any insight do you have on the Chennai consulate in terms of getting visa stamping?
I never worked in Chennai, and I can't really speak to the way things are constantly shifting. I also have to say that when I talk about profiling, and it is profiling, when I talk about running the numbers, when I talk about the rates of issuance and refusal, there's a big effort by the U.S. embassies and consulates in India to be consistent. And there's a lot of looking at the aggregate data because this is a hugely important economic relationship for the United States. Washington, D.C. is one of the only times where the president cares about visa issuance rates, right? And so the ambassador knows the H-1B issuance rate, right, off the top of their head. And that's one of those things where there's a lot of number crunching, there's a lot of verifying, and there's a big push towards consistency. What they want is in Mission India, everyone to be getting the same interview everywhere they are. So these kind of regional differences and things like that matter much less the more documented and technical the visa type becomes.
Awesome. And just to wrap it up, the last question, some of the most important questions or the common interview questions that someone will get asked if they're preparing for their H1B interview. If you can leave us with that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, the most common ones. What's your highest level of education? Do you have an end client? What's your duties at the company? How did you find this job? What's your salary? Where will you be living? Are you married? And what's your physical work location? Right? That right there, I can do that in my sleep. I probably, when I was in the depths of really doing these jobs, I probably was mumbling that to myself in my sleep. But that's the standard interview. And if you can basically, in 1 or 2 sentences, not one word, but not your whole life story, 8 to 10 seconds, 2 to 3 sentences, just answer each one of those. You could even stack the answers together, right? In likely questions. And it could be like, yep, like I have a BTech. I graduated 2 years ago. I've been working in India, and I've just been hired by this company that works in, I don't know, New Jersey. This is my office site. I don't have an end client. And I'd be like,
amazing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Approved.
Thank you so much. I hope anyone who watches this feels more confident and prepared for their H1B visa interview. And remember, the visa officer is there to actually approve the petition and not reject it. So hopefully that helps you all. Joseph, thank you so much for joining. Any parting words before I close us out?
Yeah, just if you're in a position to go in for an H1B visa interview, the hard part is over.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And if things aren't going your way, remember it's OKR, because they will eventually turn around. With that, this is Priya signing off. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.